in is this notion of transnationalizing spaces. And I'm very interested in actually alternate ways to think about and examine policy. And we happened to be on a panel together last spring, just about the time that we got the notice about the INEI competition. And I was doing something that sort of historicized citizenship education in India and Canada. Faisal was talking about transnational spaces and citizenship, and we thought of putting this together somehow. And honestly, had it not been for that proposal, we probably would not have thought to try and put those things together. So that's roughly the background. Oh, and can I just, sorry, before you go on, not to be invisible.
Thank you, Eva. I didn't say.
Sorry. Faisal and I put the proposal together. I had hoped that we got the money so that we could bring Leanne in on it as a fairly recent PhD graduate, but somebody who's done a lot of work on the ground with youth with transnational identities, and who are actively engaged in citizenship and issues, and has done that from a feminist perspective. So she brings to this a lot of qualities and experience and expertise that Faisal and I are benefiting from.
And actually, we've changed our title since the original proposal, as you've noted. Maybe some of you have seen the change into the ing form of the word transnational. And so we're trying to work with this notion of transnationalizing spaces as they are in process, right? I mean, this is what we're trying to capture with this change. Oh, and I've just turned it completely off. And so I'm borrowing Faisal's wise words here. And so we're trying to conceptualize, and we're drawing from notions of global citizenship and transnational citizenship, and we're very much distinguishing the way we're trying to think of these things from more formal, legalistic, sort of passport and patriotism type notions of citizenship. And so Faisal says, cultural diversity is now experienced in these deterritorialized spaces. And I think the events over the last few weeks are a good reminder of the complexity of this world that we're trying to understand, which are increasingly shaped by contradictions and dilemmas and risks affected by multiple dynamic, flexible, and networked affiliations. And in this new context, it poses significant challenges for policy and for policymakers in education and educators on the ground. And I've done it again. Go. So just to build on this idea, so we're talking about emerging transnationalizing spaces, and I think this was a distinction that we were talking about with Faisal yesterday that we wanted to make. And that we borrow the work of James Tilley, and he talks about how these relations of power and our traditional notions and structures are ever evolving, and they govern our conduct and interaction as individuals, groups, classes, supranational communities, in exploitative ways, in oppressive ways, in ways that are complex and multiple and overlapping. And so we're not answering any questions today. I think we're posing questions. In order to understand these new spaces, we need to critique them and look at them more in depth, and to try to figure out ways that understanding them in ways that do not, we heard a lot this morning about reproduction, right? Reproduction, that these new forms, these new ways do not reproduce these forms of oppression.
Okay, so essentially then our goal here in what we're trying to do with this project is to look at issues of citizenship and education in relation to these transnationalizing spaces. It's an area, unlike our colleagues who just presented, this is an area where there isn't a policy, really. I mean, nobody's got policy on citizenship education for transnationalizing spaces. So what we're trying to do is get ahead of the game and say, how do we start to think about what this could look like? And that's really what our goal is in all of this. And the method that we're using is something that I've been working with for several years and kind of continuing to develop, and it's an analytical metaphor called the policy web, and I'll talk a little bit more about it in a few minutes. But basically what it tries to do is map out the conversations that are happening about a particular area, so that policy actors, people who are interested in that area, can become engaged in the conversation in an informed way.
So again, I touched on this a bit earlier, but we really are distinguishing the way we're trying to conceptualize citizenship and citizen participation from more traditional approaches and notions of citizenship. We have some lovely images here from India, from Australia and Canada, and you can tell these are sort of more traditional notions. We've got the flags, we've got the map, which often defines citizenship as in a relationship between an individual kind of autonomous citizen and a state, a nation state, which is often critiqued as being sort of a maximalist notion of, or a universalist notion, which doesn't take into account the complexity of identity which exists in a transnationalizing space. So, and these
I'll just get the symbolism of the Australian one. I'll get the others.
Oh, sorry, the picture isn't large enough, but there's a number of small children waving Australian flags.
Yes.
Like someone else, I should have brought my glasses.
Yes. And we have the Canadian flag, and that
The Canadian
was
flag
actually
off of a federal building.
No, I can see that. And I can see the
And,
Indian. I just couldn't see
yeah.
what was going on
Yeah.
in Australia. It's
Yeah.
not because
Yeah.
I'm so far away.
No worries.
deterritorialized spaces. And these notions really emphasize loyalty, obedience, patriotism in those ways.
Okay, so what's been happening in terms of citizenship education, and this in all three of our countries, but probably in many more spaces as well, is increasingly the predominant discourse around citizenship education has been related to notions of social cohesion. And this idea that that it's one of the ways in which we will combat the national the threats of terrorism and help to support the national security agenda. So if we can kind of all get along, and if we can educate our children to think of our country first before anything else, then this will somehow combat the threats of terrorism. And so this has become, it's a little more complex than that. If you want to talk about it, I'm happy to do that, but this has been the predominant citizenship education discourse within the three countries for the last while.
Oh, and we have some lovely other images here, including a number of hands holding up the globe, so maybe that will help. We can talk about your youth views on climate change afterwards. But also in the bottom, so we're drawing and we're looking at notions of global citizenship and global citizenship education. So I was actually quite interested to hear a little bit more in detail what you were finding, what you will find from these young people. Because essentially, there are both very useful things about this kind of analysis or this kind of metaphor, and also some challenging things. And so I'm going to touch on a couple of those things. So often, one of the useful things about thinking about global citizenship is that it gets us beyond the confines of the nation state and the traditional nation state, and that we have allegiances and we have responsibilities to those and in other spaces. So, and then again, that goes beyond the legalistic definitions of the passport version of citizenship to allow and see the benefits of belonging in multiple spaces and belonging at multiple levels, sort of drawing on notions of cosmopolitanism. So belonging at the local, belonging at the national, belonging at the regional, belonging at the transnational. So it sees the value in these multiple belongings and multiple layers of citizenship. So one of the critiques, a central critique of notions of global citizenship is, of course, it comes from nowhere and it belongs nowhere. And so it's not rooted in any particular tradition and culture, and so therefore it's critiqued. The other critique of it is, of course, that the global infrastructure in terms of institutions is not developed to the point where it holds individuals or groups accountable to any legalistic frameworks in the same way that national identity or national citizenship does. So yes, we have UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, but Somalia can sign it, and then do these global governance institutions actually have accountability mechanisms and teeth in the way that nation states, national identity do? So often global citizenship, it takes up this notion of global interdependence and global social justice and a number of different dimensions. I can talk more about that. We've written about that in other spaces as well. But that's one of the sort of paradigms or conversations that we're looking at as framing our conversation.
So then we're moving towards rethinking citizenship and transnationalizing spaces. And part of the distinction here is that, as Leanne mentioned, in the global citizenship work, the notion is, and the smaller graphic down at the bottom, which you didn't see as clearly, I'm sure, had a little child with, here.
I'll be Vanna.
Thank you, you'll be Vanna. So the child talking about self, and then over the next corner, others, and then down at the bottom, the environment. And in the context of the local and global and historicized, and in the center of all of that is global citizenship. What's missing from that is actual national location. Where transnational, thank you, part of the reality of the transnational is actually allegiance to nations, or national contexts, and multiple allegiances. So, we've thought about it in the past in Canada and Australia through notions of dual citizenship, and other places as well. India has not really been open to dual citizenship, but has thought about this in other kinds of ways. So dual, but it's also not just dual, it's multiple for people increasingly. So there are actual locations, and it leads from the everyday experiences of people. So it's different than just saying, oh, my parents immigrated from India and therefore I'm transnational. It has to do with the fact that I have projects, I have research projects in India, I have colleagues that I communicate with on a very regular basis there. I have involvements with family who are there. I have a commitment to doing work in communities there as a part of a kind of my own commitment to making things better in that country, in the same way that I have those similar kinds of commitments in Canada. That's what makes it transnational. It's those different sets of commitments, and they are enacted on a day-to-day basis. There isn't really sort of sets of policies that talk about this. When I started hunting, let's go off to the next slide. So let me just, before I go too far on this track, let me talk a little bit about how I see policy, and so we're using this as a kind of way of guiding what we're doing here. So for me, and I mentioned this the other day when we were presenting a version of this, I teach a lot of courses on policy, as Glenn knows, and at the beginning of each of those classes I say to my students, take a little piece of paper, write down what your definition of policy. I don't ever need to see it, but just hold on to it and think about it as you go through this process. And somewhere along the line, somebody will eventually ask me my definition of policy. And my definition of policy is that at the best of times, policy is an ongoing conversation about the things that matter in a community or society. At the best of times, it's an ongoing conversation about the things that matter in a community or society. So it includes, but is not limited to, the kinds of statements that we normally associate as sort of state-based statements about a particular area. Legislation, policy documents, those are part of it. That is part of it, but that's just part of the conversation. So when we're looking here our starting point is not the literature, our starting point is policy documents. And by that, we mean certainly things like bills and acts, discussion papers, submissions to legislatures or special committees, committee reports, position papers, curriculum documents, news releases, media coverage of events. There's many other things that would be part of that list, but that's just a beginning. We have the most extensive collection of documents at this point from Canada. We have probably about 700 from Canada. And we've got about 200 from Australia and about 100 so far from India, but there'll be more coming in from both of those places. So I've looked at about 500 of the documents. I've actually looked closely at about 15 of them. So if we're having a conversation, who's having a conversation? We talk about policy actors, and some of these policy actors are state-based, some of them are not state-based, some of them are individuals, some of them are institutional. INEI is a policy actor. And so from our perspective, jumping ahead a little bit in terms of thinking about the future of what we hope might happen, is we hope that in mapping this out, we give INEI some kind of place from which this group, this network, can actually engage in the conversation in ways that you deem most appropriate, or we, if we think about all our institutions. So how do we study this? We study it through this notion of the policy web. I said earlier, it's an analytical metaphor. So this is not a model. You cannot take an idea of a web, from my perspective, you cannot take the idea of the web and neatly map out what goes where. But it is a way of thinking about policy. So if you think about a web, you have rings and you have threads to begin with. The rings in the thread, or sorry, the rings in the web are the levels at which policy happens. And thank you. There's actually a pointer there. Probably
Oh, you're right. I should just.
No, that was better.
The rings are the levels at which policy happens. So, given the kind of work I do, very often the smallest ring is a classroom, and the next one out is a school, and then a school district, and then maybe educational organizations like teacher unions, and then provincial or state government, and perhaps sometimes organizations that are involved at a provincial or state level. And then at the national level is the next ring, and then the supranational level. The threads represent areas that are connected to the central question that we're involved with. And we'll flip forward and then we can come back. So some of the threads that we've identified, and we suspect there will be more yet, in terms of thinking about the policy web for citizenship education and transnationalizing spaces, are economic development, particularly in the areas of international trade and investment, higher education, particularly around the conversations around internationalization, citizenship, obviously, citizenship education, global education, immigration, security, multiculturalism, which is a larger issue, a larger part of the web in Canada, but exists to a slightly lesser, to a much lesser extent in I think Australia and India. This notion of Asia literacy, which Fazal has been talking to us about, and I'm sure that Field and John can say more about it later on, and diaspora in India. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. So if you go back to the web for a second, Leanne, thank you. So these are the various threads. Now, there may be policy conversations happening at any of those levels about those areas. So part of all of this is about, as I said earlier, mapping out the conversation. In other work that I've done, which has primarily been on on diversity and on citizenship, what we've done is we've mapped out the discourses. And we talk about the ways in which people are talking about the issues. And we present that not to governments usually to teachers or community organizations that are interested in advocacy, to say, this is the shape of the conversation. What do you want to take out? How do you want to take it out? Where might there be, given what we know now about the conversation that's happening, where might there be a space for you to take it out? And so again, returning to the metaphor of the web, the spaces there we talk about as places where you can either extend or subvert existing policy. Some people are very nervous about subverting policy, but I am. Okay, so threads. So, what have we found so far from these documents that I've been looking at and talking to Leanne and talking to Fazal about? I think the big thing is not a big aha. I think most of you would have guessed this. That the three governments that we're talking about, the three countries that we're talking about, have this kind of ambivalent relationship to this notion of transnationalism or transnational citizenship. On the one hand, there's a wanting to engage because of not just the economic is what plays big, but also the cultural connections, the cultural benefits that accrue from engaging at a transnational level, so economic and cultural. On the other hand, there's a deep distrust of this notion of a flexible kind of citizenship that isn't fixed by anybody. And so it's a very ambivalent kind of space. Okay, so let me talk about just a couple of the threads. Citizenship and security is something that comes up in all three of the webs so far. And as I said earlier, dual citizenship is something that's been talked about in all three countries. In Canada, we've had the possibility of dual citizenship since 1977. In Australia, it was in the late 90s, I believe. In India, except for a very little blip, it's not been possible. But in India, they have these other categories. One is called NRI, it's non-resident Indian, and the other is PIO, person of Indian origin. So that's somebody like me, who does not hold Indian citizenship, but my parents held Indian citizenship, and therefore I am a PIO. And yes, and there's actually, I can get a legal designation as a PIO, which entitles me to certain kinds of privileges within the country. So these are conversations that have been happening. At the same time, our previous government, and I'm pleased to say it's a previous government, had introduced legislation that allowed the Minister of Citizenship to strip Canadian citizenship from somebody who was a dual national if they had done something egregious enough for that to happen, or if they were suspected of doing something egregious enough for that to happen. It was also deemed possible to strip citizenship from somebody who could apply, who could be a citizen someplace else, even if they were not actually a citizen someplace else. So we had a very famous case that came up during the election of a man who was born in Canada, but his parents were from Pakistan, and so the minister was wanting to strip his citizenship for a variety of reasons, but the rationale was because his parents were from Pakistan, he could claim Pakistani citizenship, although he didn't actually have it. So this is the kind of conversation around security, usually. Around these are threats to security. A very similar conversation happening right now in Australia.
I wondered where we got the idea from. Thanks.
I'm pleased to say our current government has made this a priority to repeal this piece of
Well, it'll
legislation.
take us a while to pick that one up.
Now in India it's slightly different. In India there is still this concern about citizenship and security, but it's more connected to, for example, or people who are related to, are connected with something called the World Sikh Federation, which is a group that supports an independent Khalistan for people of the Sikh faith, so an independent country. So this whole movement is supported by people who would normally be seen to be NRIs or PIOs, but they are suspect because they are supporting this kind of initiative. So it's similar concerns, slightly different contexts. Now, 3 threads that are more individualized. So the Asia literacy thread, and again I invite Field and John to talk more about this, but what I understand is from what I've read and my conversations with Fazal, is that this is a really interesting piece. It's not that in the other 2 countries we aren't concerned with making connections with trading partners or thinking about higher education internationally. It's just that the particular piece in Australia is this identification with being part of that Asian community. And that in itself is shaping identity and citizenship in particular kinds of ways. Multiculturalism in Canada. So here we get this notion that there's national identity and there's cultural identity. And increasingly, people are seeing both of those as aspects of citizenship. So national identity, it's this fixed political link to the country, but cultural citizenship a little more fluid. The idea that you know, I may have that Canadian passport, but culturally maybe I think of myself more as an Indian. But the way that multiculturalism policy sort of contains that is that, for example, all the flags of the world are within Canada, or all the different people wave Canadian flags. Both of those are
Probably at a hockey game.
no, at a citizenship
Oh,
party.
is it?
Both of those actually come from, these are, again, examples of the kinds of documents I'm looking at. These are texts that I examine. They're part of what we do. These are both from federal government texts. And in India, cultural citizenship, I mentioned just briefly already the notion of the diaspora. I said I could apply. There is a designation. There's an actual ministry for overseas Indian affairs, just for people like me and the NRIs. And the whole idea is to keep us connected. Economics, obviously a big part of that. We want your investment, but culturally as well. And there are different agendas with different governments. This photograph actually comes from something called the World Hindi Conference, which is supported by that ministry. It has been held for, I believe this is going to be the 12th year this year. It's only twice been in India. It's been in a number of other places. The goal is to promote the use of Hindi worldwide as a way of enhancing the prestige and global reach of the language, but also from the perspective of the current government in India as a way of contributing to a notion of citizenship based on an idea called Hindutva, which is that it's in some ways similar to notions of citizenship in Israel. The idea that if you're Jewish, you can be a citizen of Israel. Hindutva says that citizenship really is linked to being Hindu or part of the Hindu family. So the Hindu family includes Sikhs, Jains, and Buddhists. There's a lot of really pernicious pieces to that I could talk more about, but that's part of this particular notion of cultural citizenship that comes out of the diaspora. All right, so where do we go with all of this? There's a couple of things we're thinking about. One is just the notion of how do we, or how could we, start to imagine educating for citizenship in ways that both interrogates some of these problematic elements that we've been raising already, but at the same time values multiple citizenship.